We saw had something to do with it. Come on. Scared?
Well, why do I get hooked up with these spook details? Monsters, graves, bodies. Oh, all right.
Trust me.
Buongiorno and welcome to the Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò in New York City, of which I'm a board member. I have the pleasure and honor to introduce this book talk that is a collaboration between the Casa Italiana and the art book series of NYU Steinhardt School's Master in Visual Arts Administration, where I teach a course in market histories. The book that we are presenting today is called Ruling Culture, Art Police, Tomb Robbers, and the Rise of Cultural Power in Italy by Fiona Greenland. Fiona is a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia, but also has a PhD in archaeology. And I think this book is the brilliant result of her dual education and expertise. On one hand, in fact, it traces the history of over the past 100 years of Italy fighting to defend its incomparable patrimony of artworks and antiquity, which was illegally plundered and sold. For example, in an exhilarating chapter, she reports the rules of the perfect tomb robber from the memoir of Gismondo Tagliaferri Tombaroli Sinasce. On the other hand, Fiona looks at Italy's fight to defend its patrimony through the lens of the sociologist, exploring the cultural implication of not only asserting control over its art heritage, but of raising to the conviction of being the superior champion in a battle that has brought legal dispute against major museums like the Metropolitan, the Getty, and the Art Market. Fiona will discuss the book with Amy Whitaker, who is a professor of visual arts market at NYU Steinhardt School of Visual Art Administration, and the author of awarded books like Museum Legs and Art Thinking. I also would like to thank my dear friend Stefano Albertini, the director of the Casa Italiana, as well as Julian Sachs and the rest of the planning team, and of course you all for joining us. So I now would like to turn it over to Amy to start this discussion.
Thank you. Un cordiale saluto a tutti. È un grande piacere ed onore per me accettare il gentile invito di Stefano Albertini e Valentina Castellani a presentare il brillante libro appena pubblicato dalla dottoressa Fiona Greenland, Ruling Culture, che mi ha permesso di esplorare l'Italia nella sua straordinaria e onnipresente bellezza e ricchezza culturale. Ringrazio anche tutti gli ascoltatori che sono qui con noi. Welcome. Thank you again for inviting us. Welcome to everyone joining. My thanks again very deeply to Casa Italiana, especially Stefano Albertini, Valentina Castellani, Julian Sachs, and Dado Carrillo for the wonderful trailer, and to the rest of the team, and also to my colleagues in the Visual Arts Administration program, especially Nancy Deal, Sandra Lang, Jamie Stearns, and the rest of the team. And Fiona, my dear colleague and friend and collaborator, welcome. I'm so excited to be here to discuss your wonderful new book, Ruling Culture.
Grazie mille, Amy, e grazie, Valentina. Buongiorno a tutti. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to start us in the middle, as you do in your book, kind of in situ. You are, as Valentina mentioned, trained as a sociologist and also as a classical archaeologist. And near the beginning of this book, you set the stage where you are at a very well-known, significant dig site that has the pseudonym in the book of Virgilia. And you are with the site director, who also has the pseudonym Corinna. And Corinna is smoking a cigarette, and you come upon her. Help us understand how this story is an entry into your book.
Absolutely. I went to Virgilia to study team dynamics. So to take a step back, as an archaeologist plus sociologist, I was really interested in learning about the ways that archaeologists do their work, look through sediment deposits to make sense of the Italian past. And one morning we arrived at the dig site and everything was upside down. And Corinna was near her little office at the dig site, smoking a cigarette, irritated and upset because there had been a burglary. So overnight, while all of us were away from the site, somebody or some persons had broken in to the locked storage cabinets in the on-site office and taken artifacts. And the police arrived. So I don't know about you, Amy, but if somebody had asked me ahead of this, what happens in Italy after an archaeological theft, I would have guessed a SWAT team, a high-tech forensic team doing a dragnet around the countryside looking for clues. And that's actually not what happened. What happened was the carabinieri arrived and they inspected the site, took photographs, interviewed a couple of the dig directors, and then they left. And when I asked Corinna about this, she said, "This is quite typical. I'm not happy about what's happened. It's not really their fault. But the truth of the matter is I'm never going to see these artifacts again. And we worked really hard. It's really hard to find these kind of like precious details of the history out here in the site, and they're gone forever." And I came to understand then how complicated the relationships are. Corinna, an Italian, an archaeologist, the police, the law enforcement, right, the carabinieri, and then these unknown thieves. And it was at this moment that I pivoted away from that original study of team dynamics into something that I thought would be much more fascinating. This relationship of Italians to the archaeological past and how that heritage has been constituted, evaluated, revered, protected, but also assaulted for hundreds of years. So it was really Corinna and her cigarette and this traumatic break-in in the archaeological site that got me thinking that this might be something worth studying.
I love that. And I relate to that so much as a researcher, where you go in and you think that you have some form of control over structuring the project. And then all of a sudden you realize that actually you are in a large and beautifully complex ecosystem. And there's this kind of humility or reverence toward navigating it. And I think that's especially striking, Fiona, given your multiple forms of expertise around these subjects. And when you start to describe that kind of ecosystem, it seems that one of the main characters in it is the Tombaroli, or the tomb raider, and that I find it really fascinating, the treatment in your book of kind of how complex this idea is and how much it kind of encapsulates honor and class. And I guess I'm setting you up to tell us a story about how you deeply offended a person who's called Domenico in the book, but maybe you can also just more broadly kind of help us understand the tomb raider.
Yeah. Domenico was one of the first people I attempted to interview about tomb robbing. I was living in Rome. I would rent a room there when I went for my research trips and got to know the local neighborhood pretty well. Now, finding tomb robbers isn't as easy as posting on Facebook or putting up posters in cafes. It takes a little work, and it also takes a rigorous ethical process. So I was very adamant that I not imperil anybody's legal status or kind of out criminals who could then be in trouble with the law, and even worse, knock-on effects for the people who live with them or know about their activities. So it was therefore important that I be discreet. And some neighbors who knew of my project suggested that I go talk to this guy, Domenico, also a pseudonym, who ran a nearby bakery. And Domenico had, I later learned, done a lot of illicit removal of artifacts when he was young. His uncle taught him, and then he continued that through the years. So he graciously agreed to sit down with me, but my blunder was immediately I asked him to tell me about his uncle, the Tombarolo, and I used the word Tombarolo. So in English, we would say a tomb robber or a digger, maybe a bandit. And each of those is a somewhat culturally redolent term, but nothing like the stigma that's attached to it in Italy. And the Italian language has other words for people who dig. I could have used the term saccheggiatore, but as I also learned later, these tombaroli prefer to call themselves collezionisti. They are like collectors or antiquarians. But Domenico was angry, and he set me straight. And he said, I'm going to give you some leeway. You're a foreigner, so you don't really understand how things are around here. But that's not a term that you can attach to my uncle. And he quickly explained. So he explained that what his uncle did was dig for the love of it, for the love of history, that he dug responsibly, and he would never, he said, have robbed an archaeological site. That's like a cardinal sin and an ethical line that he would never cross. But really for Domenico, the bright line was between keeping the artifacts and selling them. And this, I came to understand too, speaks volumes about some other really important concepts in Italy regarding shared culture. So there's a concept used in Italian called demanio, and it refers to public goods or shared goods that are shared in the sense not just of being owned by the state government, but shared as a bond that brings the community together. And demanio also suggests a custodial obligation by the commonality, by the community, by local municipalities, but also fundamentally Italians who have an obligation to protect architecture, artworks, and antiquities. So that bright line for Domenico was so important because he had to reinforce to me that the kind of digging and tomb robbing that he and his uncle did not violate that central principle. They kept things for the community, but he said he would never sell it outside, which would have just torn asunder this respect for the demanio.
Yeah, it's so interesting, this kind of personal definition of ethics and service. And you write so beautifully about the gift economies around these works that are, taken and not sold, and especially not sold abroad, but given to friends, considered part of safekeeping. And this is distinct from this idea of the kind of open air museum that we can get to a little later when we discuss tomb robbers. But one of the things I found so fascinating about your book, Fiona, is that you've set up these multiple kind of kaleidoscopic tensions between the local and the global, or culture that can never be valued and culture that circulates in markets. And so I want to come back to Italy, but also jump for a moment to the kind of 10,000 meter distance to talk about this in a kind of global cultural diplomacy context. And I think this question really deserves a photographic accompaniment. You tell this incredible story in the book that pairs with this picture of Berlusconi, Gaddafi, and the nude. And I just wondered if you could kind of share this with us and kind of share some of the complexity of what you were noticing and theorizing and writing about with regard to kind of cultural diplomacy writ large.
Yeah, I'm happy to. What a picture. So the setting here is Benghazi in August 2008. And this is a diplomatic gathering involving Libya and Italy. We can see Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi on the left, and he's shaking hands with Muammar Gaddafi. Now, these two gentlemen have a bit of a backstory. So they socialized, they hung out, there were media reports of some pretty racy parties, and both worked hard at friendly relations on the personal level and then at the state or government level. So then the third main figure here, of course, is this gorgeous statue to the left of Gaddafi. So this is a now headless and armless marble sculpture portraying Venus, found at Cyrene in 1911. This is when the Italian occupation of Libya, was in place. So this statue was found by Italian soldiers, taken back to Italy. And it was there for a long time. It was there for decades and set up publicly. And very soon after it was moved from Libya to Italy, requests for its return to Libya were made. And these requests cycled through a number of key diplomatic points after the Second World War into the 1960s and 70s. And there was momentum, and then it would stall out, and momentum and stall out. Anyway, to bring it up to the present, finally in 2008, this statue is handed over as part of a multi-million euro trade agreement between Italy and Libya. So they're all gathered here in this tent, not just for the statue, right? Like the backdrop here is money and trade, but she's something of a deal sweetener. And what I found really interesting about the story, and I think that this photo crystallizes it really well, is this almost playful gesture between the two of them. This isn't a standard diplomatic handshake. There's something almost brotastic in the way that they're clasping each other's hands. And Berlusconi was quoted as saying, "Muammar, I brought your girlfriend back." And that's like classic Berlusconi humor. Here's this gorgeous nude body, right? Female body, centrally displayed there. It also, as you say, gives us this kaleidoscopic view of the entanglements of cultural heritage in Italy's global presence. So in that same chapter, much of what I discuss is repatriation back to Italy. Here's a counterexample. Here's Italy sending something back to the source country. And I will say Italy has been doing this a lot, living up to its own ethical standards for repatriation and honoring the source and provenance. But this is such an interesting case for also showing how money and diplomatic relations are brought together.
And you talk about this in some depth in parts of the book, these sort of theories of soft power and hard power in diplomacy. And I think if we put on our kind of art history formal analysis cap and pretended this picture were a painting, we could certainly analyze that handshake relative to the many kind of diplomatic transaction handshakes we've all seen. And it does have a kind of it could but will not become an arm wrestle, and it has that camaraderie of a kind of sports congratulatory gesture. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about this is that it does tie kind of directly back to the ecosystem you describe within Italy as well, and these complex interactions between the state and local communities, and the sense of ownership of the Italian public, and the sense of ownership of the idea of Italy. And I want to bring us from here to talk about the Art Squad, the official government agency tasked with preserving and protecting culture. And this, you can speak to this kind of extraordinary photo. I'll toggle back and forth, but for the purposes of asking my question, I want to go ahead to the third and final image we have today, which is a story that completely captivated me in your book, Fiona, where you talk about the Art Squad and how the Art Squad has reached out to engage the public, and especially in the context of the amazing trailer for this event and this Indiana Jones kind of idea of finding treasure, the Art Squad developed a video game, and instead of finding treasure, you successfully complete bureaucratic paperwork, which I'm sure is very beautiful paperwork. But I'm just wondering if you can kind of weave in this sort of role of government power, but government power through an organization that operates with a deep kind of process sensitivity and non-pejoratively bureaucracy. How does this kind of, the Art Squad come into play in these stories that you're telling? And I'll start here with this kind of evocative image.
Terrific, thank you. Yeah, so the setting now is the Colosseum in July 2010. And this is the presentation of the conclusion of a really successful undercover operation by the Carabinieri Art Police. And you can see one of those agents on the left. So this was called Operazione Andromeda. It netted over 300 artifacts, which had been seized by Swiss authorities in the Swiss Freeport. So once the Swiss authorities seized these objects, they were in conversation, close contact with the Italian authorities, who then swung into action to try to trace their origins. And as it turned out, these objects came from Lazio, Sardinia, Puglia. They were from throughout the central and southern parts of Italy. Some of them in a class of their own, really rare and unusual, highly valuable artifacts. And in fact, the Carabinieri estimated that if they had gone to market, they could have fetched over 15 million euros. So this is a kind of aesthetic style that is often presented in Italian media. This like presentation of all of the artifacts found, laid out and displayed, which does a couple of things, right? It speaks to the enormity of the Italian heritage. It speaks to the effectiveness of the Art Squad. It speaks also to the organized nature of tomb robbing and then the illicit antiquities trade, right? Because this is like beyond the scope of one person to be amassing that quantity of artifacts. And then I think finally what Operazione Andromeda kind of like crystallizes for us is how still there are leaky points in the system that is supposed to keep Italian cultural heritage home and part of the Demanio. How did they get to Switzerland? What are they doing in the Freeport? And what would have happened had the Swiss authorities not been tipped off? So, enormously important here. And I'm delighted that this image also speaks to the openness that gets to the term you used earlier, the open air museum. It also very much connects with that first story of Corinna at Vergiglia. So this term open air museum is often used about Italy, colloquially, but also officially. And it speaks to the kind of like density, the concentration, the multi-layered nature of Italian art and architectural and archaeological history. If you've ever even visited Italy, you know that you can hardly step outside your hotel without encountering an artifact, not necessarily in a case or in a museum, but just there are columns or there are ancient, brick roads. So it's very much about having it be part of daily life, and some resistance to fencing or walling off everything that is historic and cultural. Part of all of this, of Italian cultural heritage, of the collective patrimony, is figuring out how modernity can coexist with it all. So I think this photo nicely brings in that element too. And then the third one, wow, what a great example of the kind of like state and officialdom side to all of this. So this video game teaches players the procedures of the art squad, and it progresses room by room through their headquarters, and they're given little tasks, little details in each room to show that they understand the procedures. So this is a static image, but if you were to hover with your mouse over that picture on the left or the map on the right, info facts would come up and little quizzes that the players could take. So I thought this was a terrific insight into a public messaging about their work that tries to step away from the cloak and dagger mystique and really help people to understand the technical and scientific nature of their work.
And if you could just sort of put this in a little bit of a statistical context for us, the awesomeness of the task of the art squad, how we all would agree with you about the kind of expanse of Italian cultural patrimony, but kind of how would you quantify that if you could?
Others have done that quantification work and come up with some really interesting numbers. In fact, not long after that Benghazi handover, Berlusconi said at a press conference that Italy has 72% of Europe's cultural patrimony and 50% of the world's cultural patrimony. In fact, these kinds of statistical claims constitute a pretty lively area of public speech and scholarly work in Italy. In part, we can say, these numbers are like anchored in empirical evidence. If you want to look at how many UNESCO World Heritage sites Italy has, it's only just last year did China tie Italy for the number of those sites. So some people have looked at that through the years and said, how can this, tiny country relative to China have all of these sites, and it must speak volumes about its influence more broadly. So part of that percentage would come from something like that. Others have looked at tourism, cultural tourism. Still others have looked at like the number of museums and artworks in them. But the truth of the matter is, I think it's more helpful to understand those percentages as doing some symbolic work, making claims about not just what are the artworks and antiquities that Italy possesses, and also not really to put like a qualitative valuation on Italian art, because who's to say it's like better than any other countries, right? But more to speak about influence over time and space. And I see that that's the work that those numbers are doing.
That's so interesting. And I think gets at these very, very large concepts, like whether something is even commensurable, whether we can compare it, or how we value it, and the extent to which these exercises in valuing it have a performativity in the economic sociological sense of kind of creating what it is that they put forward. I have one or two more questions, Fiona, before we open it up. And the first is, you and I know each other through collaborating on a research paper about art scandals and markets. And I just want to introduce into our conversation more explicitly the presence of an art market. And you just mentioned this quantification of cultural value, whether it's just value that exists apart from quantification, or it's expressed with regard to tourism or national power, or kind of market value of any of these objects. But kind of in your research, how did the art market run adjacent to what you were looking at? What were some of the tensions you saw, or the roles for the market?
What a lovely question. And I'm humbled to be asked this by a bona fide expert in the art market. Let me tell you.
That's how I feel talking in front of Valentina too. So go ahead.
Let me tell you that when I started to do historical work, I wasn't prepared for the depth of feelings about the art market and the antiquities market in particular, that depth of feelings that I would find through the archival material going back. Now, my start point really is unification. But as we all know, like efforts to clamp down on the art market, to make sense of the art market, had been in place for generations. Now, just looking at the late 19th century, early 20th century, which I write about, what struck me was how Italian cultural officials and elected officials, they were not necessarily against the art market, but what they wanted was a more equitable art market. They wanted fair relationships to buyers and sellers. And one of the structural problems facing Italy was that in the last quarter of the 19th century, the market was such that the highest bidder got the object. And so the Italian government had a fund available to try to purchase things to stay in Italy. But they just couldn't compete with American railroad tycoons, industrialists who wanted to build their own museums, galleries, and in-home collections, and they really wanted Italian works. Renaissance objects were really popular, neoclassicism, Etruscan objects. There were markets for all of these things. And there was a big art scandal called the Campana scandal that sort of kicked off a public cry about why the government wasn't doing more to keep things in Italy, artworks that everybody loved. And then this enormous loophole and in the market. Why were Italians having to compete in the first place with American industrialists? This kind of became a rallying cry of the reformists, and a term was introduced, the prezzo americano, the American price. And it's what statesmen pointed to when they argued for a stricter regulation of the market and then eventually, effectively, an abolishment of it. They said this American price is what is robbing Italians of their own heritage, and we have to stop it. So it's so interesting to look back now and think that was even an issue, but it was because there were a lot of domestic issues entangled in that art market. So there were Italians who were vigorous participants in the global art market. There were Italians who relied on the ability to liquidate artworks and antiquities in order to access cash. So for them, the interest was not necessarily in building up a national cultural heritage for just anybody to enjoy. These were economic assets for them. And there were vast networks in Italy of dealers, buyers, of sellers, of gallerists who relied, on the availability and access to a market. So this art market and the antiquities trade within it, I came to understand too as a sociological phenomenon, as a really complicated set of relationships that also the newly unified national government had to assert its agency over. And this is where I really was thinking about ruling culture as a prominent and preeminent culture, but also the active to rule over it. What does it take for a new state to assert its control over this global force?
It's so interesting to think about in this context of, and when you describe that, I'm having come to mind the story of Devine, the British dealer who found that there were many British aristocrats who had incredible art collections, but were cash poor and needed to maintain large stately homes, and were quite happy, as you mentioned, the American price, were quite happy to sell works to American industrialists who themselves were essentially, if I may, trying to sanitize their reputations as kind of with respect, thuggish industrialists. And so a lot of work came over that then formed the spine of major American museum collections, because those works were ultimately donated. And I'm thinking about it in a market context where, in a way, you're describing this tension between individual actors in markets and protectors of a commons. And especially when a commons is so large that you feel like you could take a work here or there without taking away from it. But then at the same time, the state seems to be, taking a role there as a steward. And I think that's really kind of resonant. I want to throw it back to you with one final question, and you can pick up on markets or just more generally. I think, as a book writer myself and talking with a lot of people who've written books, it's a kind of common observation that the way to really know what you're writing in a book is to publish it and then speak about it. And I'm sure that, maybe that doesn't apply to you, but I wonder, just at this stage, having done this incredible body of research and written what I really would love to describe as like a joyful, erudite, lively, layered book. It was really a pleasure to read, and I learned so much. I'm just wondering, kind of, in observing something that's so complex and so human and involves such kind of complicated tensions between markets and war and peace and care and family and this kind of love of people and objects, I'm wondering if anything's kind of surfaced for you ultimately as like a true north, if you will, or the kind of like positive kind of intention or direction forward when we think about this, both purely in terms of art and artifacts, and also in terms of kind of the application of that into the public sphere, into working life, into diplomacy. Like, what were some of the things that really kind of stayed with you? And then I'll turn it over to Stefano Albertini to take us from there.
Thank you. And Amy, what a lovely question. I think it's so true that every book publisher really knows what she's saying once the book is cover to cover. I'll just pick one thing. At various stages of this project, I thought to myself, what can an American really tell Italians about their cultural heritage? And I still don't exactly know the answer to that question. Maybe it's some combination of allowing readers who know Italy really, really well, maybe from birth, to be able to step back and see their own history and culture from a different vantage point. But what really I think is the true north here is that by doing this project, I understood American culture and cultural heritage even better, could appreciate the enormity of the beautiful complexity, as you described it, in Italy, and compare back to what I see as a lot of room for growth and improvement in the United States. We have our own struggles, right, with notions of public good and shared space and a commons, and real collective investments in history, culture, and landscapes. These are things that I have come away from the project really appreciating more, and that I intend to keep thinking on with Italy as both a study area and a muse.
Yeah, I love that. I think I want to say it's Einstein and not Newton who once said, as the circle of light grows, so does the circumference of darkness around it. And I think it's a great gift of research to be able to sit humbly with how much one knows even more what one does not know, and also the sort of the kind of Homerian self-discovery at the center of these sorts of journeys. I want to say thank you again, Fiona, for your beautiful book and for your generosity sharing it with all of us. My thanks again to Valentina Castellani, who may have comments from her own expertise in market histories. A personal thanks, if I may, to Angelo and Sylvia Macera, and then Stefano Albertini. If I may turn it over to you, Stefano, to respond and open up the discussion. Thank you again to the Casa Italiana for having us.
Thank you so much, Amy and Fiona, for this wonderful discussion. And thank you, Valentina. You are the one who made it possible, brought them to us, and created this beautiful chemistry and this engaging conversation on a central topic I would say in Italian culture, but definitely way beyond Italian culture, because Fiona really poses fundamental questions on the very essence. What is culture? How does it relate to cultural identity, to national identity? And I love the way in which she, as Amy remarked in her presentation, provides this multi-layered approach, interviewing people. And that's where the sociologist interacts with the archaeologist. And to the archaeologist, objects speak, and to the sociologist, people speak. And she was able to listen, because that's the other very important thing. You need to be able to listen when people and objects speak to you. And I enjoyed the book immensely. And I could go on, but I don't want to, because also we have the fortune of having here with us students, both from the Visual Art Management program of the Steinhardt School, and students in a course that I've just started teaching on cultural diplomacy, that is part of the new program in the public humanities offered through the Graduate School of Arts and Science at New York University. But before, I'm a big fan of anecdotes, and I found some beautiful ones in your book, Fiona, but I have to share with you this small one. I'm also an elementary school teacher. So when I used to go back to Italy, to this small part of Italy where I'm from, it's near Sabbioneta, that many of you know is one of the Renaissance utopian towns of Italy, along with Pienza. So it's these foundation city, all built by these prince architect Vespasiano Gonzaga. And I arrived from the States, where I was doing my graduate studies. And the day after, I jump in this elementary school class in Sabbioneta. And all the kids come to me running, enraged, and they say, "Maestro, they want to steal the medal of our prince." And I'm totally confused at that point, because I don't know what goes on. And then they finally explained it was a second grade class. So it was like 7-year-old kids in Sabbioneta. And I just got off the plane the day before from Virginia, actually, where I was doing my master's. And they tell me the story that during works of restoration of a church in Sabbioneta, the Church of the Incoronata, that was the sort of the chapel church, the chapel of the castle of the palace, they were doing cleaning and restoration, and the archpriest, the local pastor, saw a wall underneath an altar and told one of the carpenters working there to knock it down, because he wanted to see what was behind it. And as luck would have it, they found the skeleton of Vespasiano Gonzaga, still wearing the toson d'oro, the golden fleece, given to him by the King of Spain. That happened like 2 weeks before I arrived. But what the kids were enraged for is that Mantova, that is the provincial capital of Sabbioneta, had claims and wanted to take the golden fleece, il toson d'oro, to the main museum in Mantova. And they didn't want to have it. So what is so impressive in what you were saying? I could so relate to what you were saying of Italians relating to these objects as part of their identity. I couldn't do anything for 4 hours in that second grade elementary school but talk about the toson d'oro and their prince, because their kids kept talking about, it's the medal of our prince, it belongs to our prince, it belongs to us, not to the Mantovani. Notice that Mantova and Sabbioneta are like 15 miles apart. But it really, when I was reading your reflections about how Italy identifies itself and its national identity with these objects from the past, even as it was the case for this, an object that nobody knew existed until 2 weeks before my arrival in the elementary school. So I could totally relate to that. And it's a very complicated relationship, and it's a very with many strata of discussion. So I just wanted to share with you this thing of the toson d'oro di Vespasiano and the fight that they put on. And by the way, they were able to keep it. So they opened up a small museo parrocchiale in Sabioneta. And if you come and visit, you take a little walking tour of the city, you go visit the synagogue, the palace, the church, and you can see the Toson d'Oro of Vespasiano Gonzaga. So la medaglia del nostro principe is still there.
That's a beautiful story. So evocative, so powerful.
Yeah, and it's like seeing these kids, like they ran to me. They never saw me before, and they were dying to tell me the story. Not that they thought I had any authority to prevent the move of this piece, but they wanted to share and their outrage and their pride in being part of that story. I have another couple of questions, but I don't want to monopolize the discussion, and I would like to invite our students that are present in a virtual way, as we are. If they have any question or comment, please turn on your video. I see Lorenzo raised his hand. Lorenzo Del Monde is a PhD student in classics at NYU, and he's also taking the course in cultural diplomacy. Lorenzo.
Hello. Thank you so much. I was thinking about this this tension between protecting and losing cultural heritage, and I was thinking that much of the Italian cultural heritage is actually based on looting, in the sense that many of the buildings we see that are part of our culture of the country are made through looting other buildings, especially in the past. I'm thinking about marbles, I'm thinking about statues. And so there is like this DNA of much of the buildings of our culture based themselves on looting. So I was wondering whether you thought that this problematizes to some extent at least the tension between looting and protecting, in the sense, how can really protecting cultural heritage being so effective when that cultural heritage came to being in itself through looting? I don't know if I'm explaining what I mean. So I was just wondering if you had some thoughts about that.
Yeah,
thank you.
That's a powerful question. Thank you, Lorenzo. And you're a classicist, so you understand spolia and long traditions of spolia, and how important it was for the Romans to build monumental architecture with architectonic features, pieces literally torn off other structures or looted from other peoples and brought back and reassembled into sort of celebratory, but ultimately looted assemblages. It's enormously important as a question and as a concept. And it's also not something I contend with explicitly in the book, except to say there are these cases, right, of Italy looting, appropriating objects from other cultures in this colonial period would be the example in my book. And then having to contend with that, right? Having to like square that with this sensibility of protecting Italian cultural heritage as a principle of honoring source and provenance. I think, Lorenzo, you get at something else, which is really important, is that there are multiple forms of looting. There is the garden variety of like digging in the ground with a trowel or shovel. But then what critical cultural heritage scholars are pointing to also is a kind of industrial looting, or a corporatization, a privatization, which is like this symbolic looting of the capital, the appropriation of the monetary and symbolic value of goods and objects. It's not a problem limited to Italy, of course, but it also raises really thorny questions about like whose culture it is, if we want to talk in terms of property or ownership. So I don't know that spolia transfers perfectly to capture the question that you ask, but I think as a start, we can point to some of those ongoing conversations. Yeah, and thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to ask Fiona something. I found you really interesting, entertaining, and it also made me think about a lot of important issues. So my question is very general. If every country would claim the restitution of objects that express their cultural identities, at least half of the museums of the world would be empty. So do you think that there is a concept of like global cultural ownership, meaning ultimately there are objects that belongs to the identity of all of us, of all humanity? And do you think and where one should draw a line? So, for example, there is a museum in Turin, that is the city I'm from, the first Egyptian museum ever founded. It has a collection that is second only to that of Cairo. It is there that, for example, Champollion went to study the Book of the Dead to decipher the hieroglyphs. So I think in Turin, people think that really belongs to the culture, the history, the historical culture of the city. But at the same time, those objects are Egyptian. So they belong to a culture that is not that of Italy. So how do you balance between these two extremes? And do you think that where would you draw a line in this battle of not only restitution, but how to claim your cultural identity, and where you have to stop claiming your cultural identity? Because, just go to the Metropolitan, half of it would be empty. I'm sure that I'm not saying that many of the artifacts were plundered or illegally sold, but they are physically in a place that is not the place where they were produced and whose identity they express. So this is what your beautiful book made me think about. And I still don't have an answer, but I would like to know what you or Amy or Stefano think about it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you, Valentina. It's enormous and it's important, and it's a big question with no easy answer, right? If there were a cultural property lawyer in the room, she could explain how there are lines. Those lines already exist. There are lines that generate a workable framework for cultural property ownership, title transfer, to say nothing of local, state, and national museum regulations. And then, of course, we can go right up to the global, like the UNESCO 1970 Convention, which put strict limits on the movement of antiquities according to provenance documentation. I think every claimant deserves to be heard. I think that if an object is sought for restitution, that the claimants don't necessarily need to prove identity in the sense of a personal affinity, but that it aligns with the community in which they originate. And beyond that, I really think it has to be case by case and intimate conversations involving a number of stakeholders. I can tell you, though, I really changed my thinking about universal culture as I worked on this book, because I too thought, ancient Rome, people all over the world know and recognize and love and admire ancient Rome. It speaks to them. Why not? Because there's so much material from this long stretch of time. Why not give it out and kind of like distribute it globally? But that was before I really understood that claims to universal culture can also be claims to power and control, and that my universal isn't necessarily everyone else's universal. So it is really through studying this that I came to understand, I think, these sensitivities and how important it is to keep on having conversations about the claims. Yeah. I don't want to see museums emptied out either.
If I could just add briefly, I've been doing some research related to that with what's now formed as a group called the Art, Antiquities, and Blockchain Consortium. And we've been looking at, for example, the 2018 Sarah Savoy report that was commissioned in France to look at African cultural heritage in specifically French, but also European museums. And we've been looking at how to accomplish decolonial practice and how to think about that more expansively, so that rather than thinking this is a black and white matter of emptying a museum, it's a governance problem of how to recognize the power dynamics enough to allow dignity, autonomy, orientation for difficult repair work and conversation to bring kind of stakeholders to a table, and that there may be kind of more inventive forms than a zero sum, the objects are all returned, the objects are all kept, that ownership may be recognized to a source country and some exhibition rights may be granted, that some of that may happen in a gift economy, that some of that may happen via cash payments back to source countries. And I just want to say, it makes me think of the work of Nancy Hartsock, who was critiquing Foucault's idea of power being everywhere. She said something to the effect that power when viewed from above looks like cooperation, or domination when viewed from above looks like cooperation. And I certainly, like Fiona, try to kind of second guess myself, trying to understand those dynamics. And Fiona, when you talk about the sort of like difficulty of it, and going back to Valentina's question about kind of where do you draw the line, I know this is a folksy edition, but in honor of Stefano's brilliant kind of storytelling, when I was a kid, our mother used to take us to the football games at the small college where she worked. And I remember saying to her, "Where is the line of scrimmage on the field?" Because there's so many lines painted on American football fields, some of them really grandly, if you feel sure that it's significant. I thought the line of scrimmage was painted on the field, and I finally, basically as an adult, understood that it moves, with the play. And so I think it's one of the things I really appreciate, Valentina, when I sit in on your class, and Fiona in your book, the sort of necessity of parsing a gray area, of looking at theft, of looking at power, of trying to piece that together. And I think that's one of the things that's so important as we look at, decolonial practice itself. And Ahmed Ansari, our colleague who's in the Tandon School at NYU, has said this really beautifully, but decolonial practice is also not homogenous, as itself, like incredibly varied. And so I think it's such an amazing question, Valentina, and such an important conversation that I was also really finding was activated reading Fiona's work.
Thank you. And I was thinking, I thought that quote from Foucault is perfect, Amy, and it's the whole idea of soft power, basically, that we are discussing a lot with our students. And you think that when you talk about culture, you're talking about soft power in a sort of derogatory way as being soft, but it really, and Fiona shows it beautifully in the book, it's a very powerful diplomatic tool of negotiation, and the power dynamics between the states become very evident because these restitutions and these processes never take place out of a sincere conversion of the heart or like the desire to right a wrong, but it's normally determined by very precise return mechanisms, either economical or military. Think of the perfectly chosen image of Berlusconi and Gaddafi with the Venus and the obelisk that went on for years. The last thing Berlusconi wanted to do was to perform a sort of restitution or apology for Italians' horrible colonial past in Northern Africa. It was a way for him to placate Gaddafi and get into favorable trading agreements with him. So many of the right-wing coalition that supported Berlusconi expressed a serious opposition to these operations because they saw it as such, as a sort of a way of revising Italians' colonial past. It wasn't. I mean, for Berlusconi, it was a do des. I mean, he gave something. He gave the beautiful statue in exchange for Gaddafi's, special oil pricing or any other thing that they might have negotiated, not in the open. So that's Valentina's question is perfect, but I think it is destined to remain with no specific answer because it's based on power dynamics between states, and we know they change greatly. You would have expected that, for example, the restitution of an obelisk taken during the fascist occupation of Ethiopia would happen during a left-wing government. It didn't. So it's the power dynamics are very complicated. And if I can share the screen before we go to Nina, that I saw the question and the question of the other students, just a little intermezzo comico. I want to share the screen for just a minute and show you two images, just 1 second.
And
yes.
Stefano, while you're sharing, if I can just say, I think
Sure.
you opened up such an important question of your class, which is the possibility of realistic or pragmatic means for idealistic ends.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And so this is the first image I wanted to show you, and it's also in my syllabus, and it's Matteo Renzi and Angela Merkel in Florence during an Italian-German meeting. This is 2015. So like the use of the historical artifacts, of course, Michelangelo's David in the Gallery of the Accademia. It's the real thing. It's not the copy that is in front of Palazzo Vecchio. And then I wanted to show you this image here of box statues. These are from the Musei Capitolini in Rome. And this is something that happened during the visit of the Iranian president in 2016. So only 1 year after Renzi had behind himself Michelangelo's David. They're sort of saying, yes, it's a bilateral meeting. It's me and the German chancellor, but there is Michelangelo's David behind us and he towers above us. And then you have this, because during the visit of the president of Iran, they boxed statues in the Musei Capitolini, not to offend the sensitivity of Mr. Rouhani, the president of Iran. Of course, this was a general outcry. You see the box statues here, and there are so many things that were not really clear. So why would you bring somebody like Rouhani, who is offended by naked statues, at the Musei Capitolini? Bring him somewhere else, where there aren't naked statues. And just showing the statues briefly. This is one of the statues that was boxed. And this is the other. And this is Renzi and Rouhani. The horse was allowed to remain, but the Venus and the Effable were not. I'm going to stop sharing. But I think this opposition of the use of the statue, the display of one statue, and covering the statues too. It's even, it also the dynamics that Fiona brilliantly explores work also by absence. So it's like you can use your patrimony even hiding it. So it's like it is so powerful that when you box it, you're still sending a message. It's a very different message. And of course, a lot of critics of Matteo Renzi heavily criticize him. You're denying our identity. You're selling up. I mean, not to mention what he did recently with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. But still, the idea is that by boxing and covering our artifacts, you're really giving up. But to go back to Valentina's question, is like these artifacts are powerful from a symbolical point of view, from a political point of view, from a diplomatic point of view. And so whether they're stolen, returned, exhibited, or hidden, you do not escape from them. They're like such an overarching presence. And Nina, you had a question before. So if you're ready, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Fiona, your book was absolutely fascinating. I'm so glad that we're doing this. And my question and comment kind of have to do with the art world. So actually, Amy and Valentina, I know that you both have worked for Sotheby's in the art business side, as well as the contemporary department in London. And I actually just came from Sotheby's, New York. So having this obsession with fake works versus real lingering in my mind for the past 2.5 years. I was very, very struck by Omero Borto's story, especially when we got to the part not only about his tomb robbing activities, but the very carefully crafted lifelike reproductions and the many different quotes that we have to support the idea that these aren't really necessarily fakes. So I loved the magazine quote that you included, Fiona, saying that they could not really be copies because of his status as the last Etruscan, which is a self-styled status, but that they must therefore be originals because if he is an Etruscan creating them, then they are Etruscan artifacts. And I was so interested that I found his New York Times article, which had a couple of other gems that I just wanted to bring up. So he said, don't call them fakes. I've never made fakes. And then he also said, if someone mistakes them for antiques, that's their business. And just thinking about that in contrast to the more appropriate copies that we have, like the British royal family selling the royally sanctioned reproductions of everything from crown jewels to the royal tea service. And then, every season in an old master's sale, almost every season, there is a copy after the Mona Lisa or something like that. So I was just wondering if you could speak more about what makes him or other forgers like Eli Sakai, who took the art world by storm and then was very, 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 what's the word I'm looking for? He was colorfully brought down, I guess, with the Paul Gauguin that he sold to both Christie's and Sotheby's. He had the fake and the real, combining the certificate of authenticity with the fake so that nobody would ask anything further. And then if the real was brought to the expert, then they would say, of course, this is real. I'll give you another certificate right away. So just trying to figure out like where that line is and where the more official fakes like the royals or those copies of the Mona Lisa would fall in the categories of conoscitore versus tombarolo. What would you say about like is it the cultural heritage that those people have? If they have more ownership over the culture that they are reproducing, is it more allowable? And it's not okay because Eli Sakai was copying French paintings and he's Iranian, or what do we say about that?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. Thanks, Nina. And thanks for reading the book so closely. As a starting point, fake forgery is best understood in relation to another term, replica. So replicas are fine so long as they're not sold or passed off as authentics. So Omero Borto gets into trouble because he finesses that and plays with that. He's accused of passing off Etruscan replicas as the real thing. Except that then he shifts into a really different mode in the 1970s. And he's flirting with arte povera. He's taking on the practices and the aesthetic production of arte povera, which was this like artistic movement back to craft, to traditional Italian crafts. And the way he goes about making these Etruscan vases is, he says, tribute to longstanding craft tradition rather than fakery or forgery. So he sort of like weaves himself into this movement that's happening in Italy. And I'm sure you know this is in part a response to industrialization, economic growth, and a lot of anxieties about the loss of traditional Italian culture. Omero Borto was around a long time. The art squad knew about him. He did time in jail for looting. But then I think that Omero Borto is so interesting because of this flirtation with arte povera. And then, of course, later founding this Etruscopolis theme park, this tourist attraction where he tries to recreate the Etruscan tombs that he looted in and around Tarquinia. So again, there's space here for a cultural property law expert to say, yeah, fake forgery replica, like replicas are okay, but fakes and forgeries, not. But, can I just tell you, long-standing arguments too among Italian statesmen about what to do with this problem of fakes. They were flooding the market in the late 19th century. Art market people were flipping out. They wanted to put an end to it as well. All kinds of people were making a fast buck from faked artworks and antiquities. Thanks for your question. I can scarcely do it justice, but there's always a lot to think about with that issue.
Amy or Valentina, do you want to add something to Fiona's answer? Or we have one question from Devanshi.
Hi. Yeah, I just had I was really intrigued because I was thinking of just how, like, histories of miscreants and sort of mischief are written and often within the same matrix of the very structures that oppress them or that marginalize them and erase them. And so I think that aspect of your book really appealed to me. And I think that I was also thinking of what you mentioned about the sort of political limiting and creating meanings of the cultural at this simultaneously and often in very frictional, tense ways. And I think that I was just thinking of what kind of registers of thinking you had to unthink and completely annihilate within this writing of, or sort of like telling, especially of, from a historical perspective, which is so much about linearity and progression and events and ordering, and especially when they contain so many of these marginal and, since we mentioned decolonial, like so kind of subaltern elements. And I think that was just one thing. And I was thinking of a lot of what Black Studies has been trying to do and sort of creating these avenues for thinking about miscreant histories in a sense. And so, yeah, I just was interested in what kinds of modalities of thinking you had to undo or change.
Yeah, that's a lovely question. Thank you. In this book, I really try to move away from the voice of the outraged outsider. How can they let this problem, fester? Why don't they take care of culture? And why don't they arrest all of these tomb robbers? I saw it as my obligation to listen and to be open-minded. And I also learned early in the project what a sensitive area this was, because I asked an Italian archaeologist for some assistance in chatting with locals. I told this archaeologist what my project was about, and he and I had excavated before together on the same site. And he was furious. When you get one of those screaming emails that's like all caps and the kind of like the blood drains from your head and you think, this is the end. It was that kind of email. And what he told me, Devanshi, was that I ran the risk of heroizing and glorifying Tombololi. And that if I had any respect at all for archaeology and culture, that I would stay away from this project and speak of them only as criminals. This was eye-opening. I also lost a potential collaborator. But I was able then, through that conversation, to understand the complexity of this, and also like this miscreant history is not necessarily a matter of like straightforwardly unpacking different narratives. There are people who really are like, as a matter of principle, wedded to the idea that Tombololi are criminals, and that like whatever claims they might be making to alternative history, identity, or family traditions is invalid. So I think, methodologically, like anthropologists and sociologists who go into the field, I tried as much as I could to be responsive and to listen, and then also to pay attention to classifications and categories that get recycled again and again. I came to understand that Tombololo has lived a life as an ethnonym that is attached to particular kinds of Italians from particular kinds of backgrounds, often associated with rurality and working class. So then I could kind of pay attention to those signals and markers and what other kinds of work that label was trying to do to marginalize these people. This is not an apology for the illicit antiquities market. It is not an endorsement of kind of like free trade in antiquities. It's not at all that. There are people who dig ruthlessly violate the law and profit from antiquities, and that needs to end. But what I try to show in my book is, again, the multi-layered complexity. And if I could just make a final point that I think wraps up these last few questions, there's a real need here for public humanities to address these questions of identity, knowledge production, cultural traditions, ownership, criminality, and restitution. And my understanding of public humanities is that it is fundamentally inclusive and pedagogical and really tries to reach diverse public audiences in having these conversations. So thanks for the opportunity to be in conversation with you all.
If I may, I'll close and turn it to Stefano for the ending. First, Devanshi, Nina, Lorenzo, thank you for the stunning questions. And I can only hope that you are writing research papers on all of these topics, or otherwise sharing your reflections back with all of us. And also, Valentina, thank you for being the force to make this happen. Stefano and everyone else at Casa Italiana, our deepest thanks for the opportunity and for your warm and rigorous scholarship and generous hospitality. I just want to close by saying, Fiona, the labor of writing a book is incredible and is such a gift to us to be able to grapple with the complexity of cultural value, market value, national identity, soft power, and also in the most hopeful way to bring creative and liberal arts to life in the practical world as constructed around not only markets and nation states, but also communities and groups of people, and these kind of the abiding values that cause people to care for objects and to gift them and to have pride in them. And thank you for the opportunity to join you in your work. And Stefano, again, thank you so much for hosting us, and over to you.
Thank you very much to all of you. You couldn't have wrapped it up better, Amy. Thank you. Thank you, because you really brought in all the themes, the topics, and the relevance and the timeliness of Fiona's book. I just want to thank you again all very much. Thank the students. They're brilliant. I'm lucky. And I just want to say that tomorrow is March 25th. It's Dante D. It's the International Dante Day, in which we celebrate yet another piece of the patrimony of Italy. It's a linguistic piece. It's the literary piece. It's the centerpiece. So all of tomorrow is going to be dedicated to Dante. It's 700 years from his death that we are celebrating. And we have a series of things going on with the Opera di Santa Croce in Florence. And it's a virtual tour. It's a virtual Dantes tour of Florence. There's going to be an homage that we pay to Dante in New York, in Dante Square at Lincoln Center. So please take a look at our website. Join us in celebrating the great Dante, the ultimate element of the Italian cultural patrimony. And thank you all again very much, Amy, Fiona, Valentina, and all the students. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. Thank you, Valentina. Thank you, Amy. What an honor to be here.